Zoom, welcome back. Hello, folks in the room. Just gonna let our audio folks connect there for 1 second. And it's great to have you here, to see you here. This is week 2 of the History of Material Text workshop for the fall semester, and my brain is slowly coming together. Great to see you all. Old friends and new. So if you are not a long-time veteran of the workshop in the history of material texts, we meet Mondays in this very space where we hear talks ranging from, well, as last week, the near prehistory of the Cairo Geniza to, as we'll hear today, the 20th century, maybe even the 21st century here in our own Philadelphia neighborhood. So I think that those two talks last week and this can give you a sense of the range of the seminar. We're open to all interested folks, whatever your level at Penn, and if you are not from Penn, you are just as welcome. So if you like what you hear, please spread the word. There's a sign-in sheet going around. And if you put your email there, our amazing Bristol Schoenberg graduate fellow, that's Lila Goldenberg right over there, will add you to our mailing list. We don't send you much mail, but we keep you in touch with what's going on, and you're welcome to forward those notes to whomever you like. For Zoomers, we continue to broadcast remotely into the foreseeable future, so you can also tune in that way. I have one announcement. Next week we'll hear our Penn colleague, Rehan Durmaz, talking about immigrant voices on paper and Arabic newspapers and Arabic printing in the United States. My announcement is that we've had a substitution on October 9th. That's a few weeks from now. Gabrielle Foreman will not be able to come and speak for family reasons, unfortunately, but very grateful to Tom Levine, who has agreed to step in. Tom is at Princeton and will be speaking on something he called audio letters in the 20th century. So that sounds intriguing, and we are very grateful that Tom is willing to do this at short notice. So that's a few weeks from now. Any other announcements and other things from any folks? Okay. Well, I guess perhaps this goes without saying, but at least in my case, I would say that rather than looking at prisons, we often tend to look away from them, except when perhaps, dramatic tales of escaping prisoners fill our video feeds and our media channels. Even though we theorize regularly about imprisonment and punishment, of course, we too rarely think about the lives of prisoners. And prisons, it seems to me, often are so far outside the realm of experience that we discuss in academic settings, at least, that they're as if on another place. In Philadelphia, it wasn't always so. Prisons were extraordinarily central to early Philadelphia, as many of you, I suspect, know. Eastern State Penitentiary, that we're going to focus on tonight, was founded opened in 1829. Is that right? 1829. Before that, and sort of overlapping with it, there was the infamous Walnut Street Prison, right down in the fancy folks' neighborhood of Society Hill now. And in a strange Penn anecdote, Provost William Smith was imprisoned there and seems to have, and this would have been in the 1760s during a political squabbles of early Pennsylvania, and seemed to have actually taught classes from Walnut Street Prison. Yeah. Today I'm excited because we're going to look behind the wall, so to speak, of the extraordinary, and if you know Philadelphia at all, the extraordinarily dominant penitentiary on Fairmount Avenue called Eastern State. And if our discourses, including some of the things I brought from the Kislak Center collection that are on the table, are usually written by governors and leaders and outsiders about prisons and prisoners, the annual reports, the charts, the graphs, the imagery. Here, our speaker, Damon McCool, is going, I hope, and I think, attempt to tell us and instruct us about the voices of prisoners themselves. And this strikes me as something we need to do more of, and is really a new discourse. Our colleague Whitney Tratine has been working with Damon and his colleague Erica Harmon and others on the hundreds of newspapers written by incarcerated people printed in U.S. prisons, including Eastern State. And if I quote you for a second, she speaks of these as a powerful counter archive to the mundane government forms and booklets that usually are our prison discourse. So tonight, though, Damon's talk is entitled Printing in Prison. Damon's a historian and senior specialist of research and public programming at Eastern State Penitentiary. He has his MA from the City College of New York. Are you a New Yorker?
I consider myself one.
All right, that's good enough. And he has worked in, he's a museum professional, has over a decade of experience working in museums and also working with formerly incarcerated people. He has contributed to many exhibits and public programs, topics including healthcare in prisons, prison journalism, sports and leisure in prisons, and tattooing in prison. That would be a fun other talk. We'll get you back for that one. And he is also, this is a very 19th century title, an official visitor of the Pennsylvania Prison Society, which means that he is an advocate for the incarcerated throughout the state of Pennsylvania. So we're really grateful that Damon has agreed to come and speak with us tonight. I know the Zoomers can't see this, but Damon will describe this awesome typewriter object in front of us, and if you haven't had a chance to try it before we started, you can do so after. So over to you, Damon, and welcome.
Thank you, Steve. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, John. Thanks, everybody, for having me here. Thank you for coming here this evening. Thank you for tuning in on Zoom. Better?
Yeah, we got it.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Like John said, I'm a historian. My job is to research Eastern State Penitentiary as a building, also research the people that lived and worked there, as well as research issues of contemporary criminal justice reform and mass incarceration. And I use all that research to help build museum programs and exhibits at Eastern State Penitentiary. Has anyone in this room been to Eastern State Penitentiary before? Some people, hopefully some folks on Zoom have been there before. So a little history about the building itself. Eastern State Penitentiary was a prison. It was built in 1829 on a cherry orchard just outside of Philadelphia. It is perhaps best known for its architecture, which is radial in design and resembles the spokes of a wheel. When Eastern State opened in 1829, it was founded on a single principle, and that was that rehabilitation for people in prison was really only possible through a system of solitary confinement. The founders of Eastern State believed that only by sitting in a cell alone for their entire prison sentence, working a job, studying the Bible, could an individual really consider the crime that they committed, achieve some sort of penitence, which is where the word penitentiary comes from, and leave the place a better person than they were when they got there. And this idea was practiced on tens of thousands of men, women, and sometimes children for over 80 years, until 1913, when Eastern State decided to ditch solitary confinement in favor of a more congregate living arrangement, one in which incarcerated people started doing things together for the first time, like working together, worshiping together, playing sports together, sometimes escaping together, and writing newspapers and magazines together. Eastern State closed as a prison in 1971, and it sat abandoned for over 20 years before it became what it is today, which is a stabilized ruin, but also a historic site and museum. Our mission as a historic site and museum is to interpret the history of American criminal justice reform from the nation's founding all the way up to the present. And that includes the era of mass incarceration that we're currently in. So up until very recently, the United States had the highest rate of incarceration on earth, which means that we imprison more of our own people than any other country in the world. In the United States, the likelihood of somebody going to prison depends largely on their race and their class. Now, I know that we're here to talk about prison newspapers and magazines, but I could not pass up an opportunity to tell you about other records you might find in a prison archive. Hopefully that'll give us a more complete picture of the material text of prison. So this is what's called an intake card. It would have been completed by a prison administrator as soon as somebody arrived at Eastern State to begin serving their sentence. It includes a lot of information you might expect: the person's name, where they're from, the crime that they've been convicted of. But it also includes some information you might not expect, like whether or not their parents were alive, whether they smoked cigarettes or drank alcohol. If so, how much alcohol? Was alcohol involved in part of their crime? This record group is special because sometimes, although not all the time, it comes along with a picture of the person. Today we call that a mugshot. This is a discharge docket. This document tells us how and when somebody left Eastern State. Were they paroled? Did their sentence expire? Did they escape? Did they die in the building? This is one of the only record groups that tells us where a person lived inside of the building during their incarceration. The column on the right that's highlighted in red says things like 7B, 8B, 6B. This means cell block 7, cell block 8, cell block 6. Our museum visitors are always surprised when we tell them that, for the most part, we really have no idea where somebody spent their incarceration. Unless, of course, the person was Black or a woman, because the prison was segregated by race and sex. This is a convict reception register. It includes a lot of the same information that's on other prison records, except that this is where somebody's tattoos are described in detail. This person had a lot of them, including one of the devil riding a bicycle, which is pretty rad. And this is the Warden's Daily Journal. This is where punishments were described. So here we can see prisoner B 7426 was placed in solitary for fishing out of their window and using bad language to the overseer. In prison, fishing is when one person sends something, like a note or a letter, to another person secretively. You may also expect to find in a prison archive historic love letters, like this one. This is from a series of love letters we have from 1862. They're written from a prisoner named Elizabeth Elwell to her boyfriend, Albert Jackson. Both of them were imprisoned at Eastern State at this time. I should mention that Eastern State incarcerated women for about 100 years. In these letters, they talk about all sorts of things, especially breaking a lot of the rules in the building. And of course, in a prison archive, you can also expect to find newspapers and magazines. So really beginning in 1800, but genuinely taking off in the 20th century, incarcerated people in the United States and elsewhere started writing and publishing newspapers, magazines, newsletters, whatever we want to call them, and maybe that's something we should decide here tonight. These newspapers and magazines formed a crisscrossing network across the United States and North America that connected incarcerated people in a way that may not have before. Almost every prison in the United States had a publication like this. There were hundreds of them. And there were several at Eastern State. Although tonight I'm only going to talk about the big two, the Umpire and the Eastern Echo. So the Umpire is the older of the two publications. Again, it's written and published by incarcerated people at Eastern State. It was in publication from 1913 to 1918. We're missing a couple of years of these. So if you know where they are, please let us know. These were printed weekly, and the motto when the paper came out was devoted to the interests and recreation of good fellowship. That motto would change slightly over time. Now, in order to understand anything about the Umpire, we have to know something about the importance of baseball at Eastern State in the early 20th century. Baseball was the cultural centerpiece of Eastern State Penitentiary in the early 1900s. Prison administrators saw baseball as a tool of reform and rehabilitation because it taught things like discipline, teamwork, camaraderie, and patience. Prisoners at Eastern State understood that baseball was a sacred privilege and something that could always be looked forward to and participated by anyone. Baseball wasn't just for people who played baseball. There were coaches and managers. Obviously, people at Eastern State wrote prolifically about baseball inside of the prison. And anybody could be a fan or a spectator. I should also mention that baseball is still played in some prisons in the United States. San Quentin Prison out in the Bay Area of San Francisco has a baseball team called the Athletics, which is interesting because the Athletics used to be a Philadelphia baseball team with deep ties to Eastern State Penitentiary. So the Umpire is telling us about all things baseball, sometimes outside of the prison, but really zooming in on baseball life inside Eastern State. They even tell us the names of the teams. We've got the Cubs, the Library, the Ninth Block, the Plasters, the Stocking Shed. And the Umpire tells us who is playing for each team by their prisoner number. This might seem like a small detail, but when we go through and look at who is playing on each team, we discover that all but one team had both black and white players. That tells us that baseball at Eastern State was racially integrated 50 years before the rest of the prison desegregated. And that's important. This last summer, my colleague Jerome Loach did a really deep dive on one player for the Ninth Block, prisoner 4997. His name's Jack Blackburn. Jack Blackburn is a great example of what my friend calls famous prisoners you've never heard of. Blackburn was well known in his time as a professional boxer. But during his incarceration at Eastern State, he really stood out as a baseball player. Eastern State prisoners were hitting so many baseballs over the wall that Jack Blackburn personally reached out to the manager of the Athletics, Connie Mack. He's the fellow on the left there with the hat on, asking Mack, if you have any baseballs that you can part with, any that you're not using, can you please send them to Eastern State? We could really use them. Mack responded immediately by sending hundreds of baseballs to Eastern State. When Jack Blackburn finished his incarceration at Eastern State and left the prison, he went on to become the trainer for Joe Louis, probably one of the most celebrated boxers in American history. There's a picture of the two of them together on the right. When Jack Blackburn died, his funeral was attended by Joe Louis, Cab Calloway, and 10,000 other people. So what else can we expect to find within the pages of the Umpire? Well, of course, everything baseball, scores and recaps. Also musings, riddles, jokes that I never get. I do not understand the humor of this era. And some puzzles as well. Every edition usually came with one or two illustrations as well. The Umpire also tells us about music life at Eastern State. So at Eastern State, when they came out of solitary confinement and started doing things together, music was a big part of that. There were bands and orchestras and choirs of prisoners that performed in the building, and also outside bands, orchestras, and choirs came in to perform at Eastern State almost regularly. And the umpire tells us exactly what that looked like, who was doing it, and how and where it happened. Today at Eastern State in our museum, we give tours about music at Eastern State, and we are looking at these sources to help us put that content together. Sometimes articles in the Umpire were written in languages other than English for people who are newer to the country. This article is written in Italian. It describes the process of parole. There was some confusion among Italian-American prisoners as to why the state would continue to monitor people after their incarceration, and this article aims to explain that. There's also
Oh, I'm sorry.
there was also a lot of poetry in the Umpire as well. This is my favorite poem. It's called Ode to Mr. Mouse. And it was written by Eva Cole, who was incarcerated at Eastern State. Eva is not the only Black contributor to the Umpire, but she might be the only woman who contributed to the Umpire. Not entirely sure about that. As time went on, a really robust classified section started to emerge in the Umpire, which is great. We can see people's side hustles through these pages. We know the crafts that people were making and selling, the services that they were providing in the prison. Believe it or not, animals were even bought and sold as pets in this marketplace. So we get a really interesting glimpse into smaller economies that were operating inside the prison walls in the early 20th century. Eventually, a prisoner welfare organization called the Honor and Friendship Club emerges and starts to not really take over the Umpire, but they get their own page eventually. So the Honor and Friendship Club, like I said, was a prisoner welfare organization that did a couple of things. One of the things that they did is pay rent for families of prisoners who were having a hard time making ends meet on the outside. They would pay for the burial costs of a member who died in prison so that their body didn't have to go to the anatomical board, being redistributed to colleges and universities and medical schools. Eventually, the Honor and Friendship Club would create the Children's Christmas Fund, which collected money from prisoners, and they used that money every holiday season to purchase Christmas gifts for the children of people incarcerated at Eastern State. Pretty remarkable stuff. Eventually, the Honor and Friendship Club notes would occupy the entire fourth page of the Umpire. I should also note that the warden of Eastern State at this time was a man named Robert McKenty. He's a very controversial figure. He's often accused of nepotism and corruption. My opinion, though, is that McKenty's views on prisoner autonomy and programming in prison was progressive, even for today. Nevertheless, McKenty had a reputation of injecting his own personal crusades into the daily life of Eastern State. And sometimes that came through pretty clearly in the pages of the Umpire. So for example, McKenty was very concerned about prisoner involvement in World War I. He saw a crisis of masculinity within the men of his charge. None of these men could go serve in the war. They weren't working in factories producing things for the war. So he felt that the men at Eastern State, and I'm speaking specifically of men at this point, wanted to be more active, play a more active role, and McKenty certainly wanted them to. This starts out with some light philanthropy, gathering some money. Prisoners start purchasing war bonds. Eventually, they purchase an ambulance. They also do other things. They make 1 million tent pegs. They sew bandages for the Red Cross. And as the article on the right hints at, they're also growing war gardens. So what this means is that prisoners at Eastern State during this period, late 19-teens, were using every available inch of land in the building to grow produce. And that includes the roofs of the cell blocks. The idea here is that prisoners could grow their own produce and consume it, and that way grain and other supplies could make their way to Europe. Eventually, the call to play a more active role in World War I started to take the shape of letting prisoners leave Eastern State to go serve abroad. We see several articles in the Umpire advocating for this cause. It's a highly debated topic, among people who study Eastern State in the early 20th century. But we believe that eventually this effort was somewhat successful. Some prisoners were paroled specifically so that they could go serve in Europe. It might not have been as large of a number as McKenty wanted, but we do have strong evidence that that happened. Some years after the war, a plaque was commissioned. It's made out of bronze. It was designed by a prisoner. And the purpose of the plaque is to honor the incarcerated people at Eastern State who left the prison to go serve abroad. The plaque is still standing. So next time you're at Eastern State, you can see it. It's in the middle of the Central Surveillance Hub. You cannot miss it. As the paper got older, the tone of the publication became more serious. It became more about prison policy, legislation, issues that were more seriously impacting incarcerated people. When legislation was passed that changed the way prisoners work and how much money they get paid to work, the Umpire was reporting on that. The Umpire reported on the goings-on of the Pennsylvania Prison Society, the 18th century organization that built Eastern State and is still around today. And the paper even included some articles on the abolition of prisons and jails. The end of the Umpire at Eastern State sort of coincides with the end of Robert McKenty's time at Eastern State. The Umpire ends in 1918. McKenty is forced out in 1923. A grand jury came into Eastern State in April of that year. They discovered alcohol stills, heroin, a network of prostitution inside of the building. McKenty was forced out. The chaos of the era is well documented in a series of political cartoons, some of which I've put here. These cartoons were drawn by an incarcerated person named Edward Mitchell. There are maybe a dozen or so of them. They're currently housed at Swarthmore as part of the Anna Wharton Morris papers. It would be another about 40 years before another publication seriously emerged at Eastern State Penitentiary, and it was called the Eastern Echo. It was in publication from 1956 until 1967. Again, it is written and published by the incarcerated people in Eastern State. It was published quarterly, so less frequently than the Umpire, and its focus was really on prison and justice reform. If you're wondering about the picture that I put up there, in the early years of solitary confinement at Eastern State, whenever a prisoner was outside of their cell, they had to wear a hood over their head so that they couldn't recognize any people they may have passed, and they also wouldn't be able to understand the layout of the building. So that photograph there on the cover of the Winter '63 edition is a photograph of an early Eastern State prisoner wearing a hood. The Eastern Echo's got kind of a strange logo when it emerges. It's a person hitting a gong with the word echo coming out of the gong. On the first page of the first edition, the editor lets us know immediately what this publication is all about. He writes, "This magazine is the newest entry into the penal press field. It will be the policy of the editors to present articles, poems, and stories which express the thoughts and feelings of the men confined in this institution." At this point, there's only men at Eastern State. The Eastern Echo is your magazine. It will be only as good as you want it to be. Some penitentiaries have a good magazine, and others have an indifferent one. The Eastern Echo is intended to be the voice of the men in here. So we see this phrase penal press mentioned in the opening paragraph here. The penal press is an umbrella term that describes all of these magazines and newspapers and publications all throughout the United States. And it's also a term that describes this movement of prison journalism in the 20th century. You'll hear and see that phrase come up several times. The Echo was printed in the Eastern State print shop, which did way more than just cranking out this particular publication. The print shop at Eastern State was one of, if not the most lucrative industries operating inside the prison, and it was also one of the best places to work if you were incarcerated. The first issue of the Echo even does a spotlight feature on the print shop. It tells us what's going on in there, who's working in there, and they even show us a picture of some of the machinery that was currently in use. They also give us a little history lesson on printing at Eastern State. They show us a photograph in that first edition of the very first print shop at Eastern State, about a half a century earlier. They tell us how the echo is coming to us. First, it goes to the linotypist, and then it's passed to the compositor. They sat next to each other in the print shop. And then the newspaper would go to the print room, where it would get one final look before being sent to an industrial press within the print shop, where it was cranked out in mass. Like I said, the administrators at Eastern State weren't doing all of this just for one prisoner newspaper. No, it was a very lucrative industry, and the print shop cranked out materials for various state organizations, schools, hospitals, and of course, almost every document that was circulated amongst the Department of Corrections was printed in the print shop as well. A couple of years ago, I accidentally discovered where I think the editorial offices of the Echo were, which is different than the print shop itself. I was watching a movie about Eastern State that was filmed in the 1950s. It follows a prisoner named George. And I noticed in this one scene, there's this very particular, strange looking piece of metalwork coming out of the wall between their heads. And when I look a little bit more closely, we can tell that it's the logo for the Eastern Echo. So I wonder someday if Eastern State as a museum is to have a permanent exhibit about journalism, if it should be in that room. One of my favorite things about the Eastern Echo and the penal press in general is that it was not just intended to be read by people who were incarcerated. It was intended to be read also by people on the outside, like the people in this room who are not currently incarcerated. The back inside cover of every edition had a subscription page where for $1 if you lived here and $1.30 if you lived abroad, you yourself could get a subscription to the Echo. In 1957, about a dozen workers for the Eastern Echo held an unprecedented meeting with representatives of the 3 Philadelphia newspapers to, quote, build a bridge between us and the public. They said, we as a group are stigmatized. We want to build a bridge between us and the public. And it's really important to understand when we think about the content of the Echo and why these folks were writing it. Eventually, the message would become even more forward. That subscription page would go on to say, this is a magazine that is written, designed, and published by inmates to bring the outsider inside the walls for a closer look at prison life. Now, for us here in the 21st century, this is a little bit difficult, at least for me to imagine, considering that today in the United States, as John mentioned in the introduction, prisons are some of the most secretive, least transparent institutions in our society. We know a little bit about the people that contributed to the Echo. A few years ago, I did a feature on Selby and Chandler. He's one of the only Black contributors to the Empire. Chandler was a veteran before his incarceration. I'm not sure if he was a journalist or not, but he had a pretty prolific writing career during his incarceration. He had a reoccurring article in the Echo called Themes and Variations, where he wrote about the music scene at Eastern State. But I think his best piece is titled 1920 to 1956. It was an interview with the oldest prisoner in Pennsylvania at the time. His name was Augustus Pasquale, who happened to be incarcerated at Eastern State at that time. He also died in the prison, tragically. Like the Empire, the Echo also reported on sports at Eastern State, although by this time, mid-50s, early 60s, other sports had eclipsed baseball as the most popular at Eastern State, and we can see some of them here. There was also a letter to the editor section, just like there was in the Empire, but this time, letters to the editor could also come from the public. Like this one I've highlighted here, from somebody named Dorothy Shear. She writes, your magazine has poked some good-sized windows into the wall, which I think is really poetic and a really powerful thing to say about the penal press in general and the Echo in particular. One of my favorite sections of the Echo is a reoccurring article about chess culture at Eastern State, which was really vibrant. So Eastern State had a chess team that was part of the Philadelphia Chess Club. Anytime their opponents played the Eastern State team, the opponents had to come into the prison to have that match for obvious reasons. And because of that, the chess matches were thoroughly documented in the Echo. I also really like the coming attractions section. So there's a chapel at Eastern State Penitentiary. It's an enormous room, and historically it doubled as the prison's movie theater. So the coming attractions sections lets us know what movies were being shown at Eastern State and when they were being shown as well. I should also mention that this penal press has really amazing cover art. Eastern Echo has some really great ones that I think are good, but just thumbing through some of the others from the period, I could spend hours just looking at some of this artwork on the cover. If you are into mid-century art and design, historic prison newspapers are definitely something that you want to look into. So really the content of the Echo was very serious, and it was, again, as I mentioned earlier, focused on what's impacting the lives of incarcerated people, what's new in the world of penology, as it was called in that time, or criminal justice reform, as we might call it today. These journalists were writing about issues that are intensely debated today. How progressive is progressive penology? Half of a century before we were really starting to debate it in the 21st century. They were talking about starting 12-step programs in the walls, debating how serious and important sobriety and recovery is for people who are incarcerated. And it wasn't just incarcerated people that were contributing to the Echo. Judges wrote pieces for the publication. Assistant district attorneys wrote articles, and even faculty from the University of Pennsylvania contributed. The 10th anniversary of the Echo gives us an 8-page spread on the print shop, which includes a ton of information about the Echo. I'm not going to show it here because it's a lot of really dense text, and a lot of the mechanics and machinery are over my head. But I did want to include the photographs because I think they're really special, and they can tell us a lot too. By looking at these photographs of the print shop, we can get a sense of what incarcerated people were wearing in the mid-1960s. We can see what civilian employees were wearing as well. We get a sense of style. We can see how people were styling their hair. We can see what kinds of cigarettes they were smoking. We also can see some tattoos. But most importantly, I think, we can see black and white people working in the same place, which was exceedingly rare at Eastern State Penitentiary, where the entire prison was segregated by race for 130 years, and it was also segregated by labor. So black and white prisoners often did not do the same things, but we know from photographs like this that they were working in the print shop together. They were working on these historic prison newspapers and magazines together. Unlike the Umpire, we know exactly why the Eastern Echo went out of print. This is an article that was published by the Philadelphia Daily News in May of 1957. It tells us the entire staff quit last month when it was asked to make revisions in some of the articles submitted for the April issue, which was to be on sex in the prison. A prison spokesman said that the inmates will be asked to elect a new staff. To my knowledge, that never happened, and the Echo was never printed again. But wouldn't it be great if we could get our hands on that April edition about sex in an all-male prison? Right? I've never seen that. I'm not sure if it's still around. I don't want to make it sound like people in prison aren't still writing today, because they are. There's some great examples of this that I want to highlight, like the Angolite, which I actually have some physical copies with me here tonight if you want to thumb through it. This is from a prison in Louisiana. Its more formal name is the Louisiana State Penitentiary, but it is casually known as Angola, and their publication is the Angolite. And there's also here locally Greater Friends, which is a publication that's circulated throughout the 20 or so prisons in Pennsylvania. It is written and published by people in prison with the help of the Pennsylvania Prison Society. Now, although people in prison are still writing, to be sure, and we'll talk more about what that looks like in just a moment, I do want to say that there is an arc to the history of the penal press, right? It begins in 1800. I would argue that it really takes off in the 20th century. And then I would also argue that it sees a pretty sharp decline around the same time that mass incarceration starts to take off in the US. So paradoxically, I think at the moment when the prison population is skyrocketing in ways that it never had before, prison publications like the Umpire, the Echo, the Angleite, some others start to decrease. We see less of them with less frequent publication dates. And of course, there are exceptions to this. And again, people were writing, but I don't think with the same frequency that they were in the middle of the 20th century. If you would have asked me 5 years ago, what's new in the world of historic prison newspapers, I probably would have said nothing. Nothing is really new. But that's not true today. There's a lot going on in the world of historic prison newspapers. Prison journalism is experiencing a bit of a renaissance, and some of that work is being done right here at the University of Pennsylvania. Winnie Trattin and her team here at Penn have digitized every every issue of the Umpire that Eastern State has and made it available online, and perhaps best, sorted the articles by topic. So if you want to crack the code on humor in the early 20th century, like I try to do, you can go there and sift through these articles and look through and read all of those jokes, that advice, that gossip as well. That's a really, really useful tool when exploring these publications. Being able to search by topic, I think, is going to be really important. JSTOR, the online library, also has a project called the American Prison Newspapers, 1800 to the present. They are collecting every prison newspaper they can get their hands on, putting them online. It will also include every edition of every prison newspaper or magazine that they have. And you can select whichever one you want and thumb through them, just like you would a normal magazine. I should also mention that this is free. Don't need a subscription to JSTOR in order to check out these publications. Prison museums like Eastern State Penitentiary are becoming more common throughout the United States, and they're bringing out their own historic newspapers and magazines as well. So last week I was in Boise, and I was at the old Idaho State Penitentiary, which is a fantastic prison museum if you were ever out that way. And they have a couple of prison magazines themselves. One is called The Clock, and the other is called The New Breed News. The New Breed News is unique in that it was written and published by and for indigenous prisoners at that site. So that definitely deserves its own research there as well. My hope is that as more prison museums emerge, that they'll start to bring out their publications in the same way that Eastern State talks about the Umpire and the Echo with our visitors. Really, I think that the Prison Journalism Project is standing out right now as doing perhaps the most impressive work in this area. So PJP, or the Prison Journalism Project, started a few years ago. Their mission is to train incarcerated people to become journalists so that people in prison can be the ones that are writing news about what's happening to people in prison, right? All too often, all of the news that we consume about people who are headed to prison or people who are in prison are almost exclusively written by people who are not in prison, oftentimes written by law enforcement or given to magazines and newspapers by law enforcement. So the Prison Journalism Project is really doing a great job in training folks to become writers themselves. The Prison Journalism Project exists mostly as a digital archive right now. They do have one physical publication. It's called PJPX Inside. It's a physical paper that can be circulated as well. And I've got some copies here, but for the most part, it exists digitally, which makes it really accessible. You may have seen this article in your news feeds over the last couple of weeks, listening to Taylor Swift in prison. This article was written by a journalist who was trained by the Prison Journalism Project. I think this is in the New Yorker, if you're curious about reading more. So at Eastern State right now, we've got a little pop-up experience about prison journalism. It doesn't happen all the time. It depends on what our staffing is like that day and whether there's a scheduling conflict in that room. But we want to tell our visitors about the rich history of writing at Eastern State. So we'll show them the Echo, the Umpire. We'll talk about the content, some of the authors. We also want to make contemporary connections when we talk to our visitors about writing in prison. And we felt like one of the best ways to do that was to purchase an artifact to really show how people in prison write today. So for the people who are in this room, you can see in the center of the room, there's a clear typewriter. For the folks tuning in at home, there's a clear typewriter here. It's made by a company called Swintech. And this is the machine that somebody who's in prison must purchase if they want to do serious writing during their incarceration. If you're wondering why the machine is clear, it's so that people in prison can't conceal any contraband items inside of it. That's not unique to typewriters. If somebody in prison buys a television or a radio or an MP3 player, it's also clear for those same reasons. Although, as I said to some folks earlier today, I am assured by my friends who are in prison and formerly incarcerated that you can hide lots of things in a Swintech typewriter. So I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to type on it if you want to, just like our visitors do. We want you to get a feel of the way it sounds, the way it looks, the way it feels, etc. So please feel free to type on it. But there are some other things that I was hoping that we could talk about tonight, some things that Eastern State wants to consider as we start to think about what role journalism is going to play in our programming. So I want to know, is this subject of prison journalism compelling enough for Eastern State to build a permanent exhibit about it? How do we get our visitors excited about historic prison newspapers and magazines? How can we work with other prison sites and their publications archive? Remember, this was a network. And how do we connect our visitors with prison journalism today? So I just want to take a step back. I've been doing a lot of talking. If anybody has any questions about newsletters or magazines at Eastern State, I'm happy to answer them to the best of my ability, but really love to hear some suggestions for people about how we can make this exciting for our visitors.
Stop the share.
Oh, sure.
And I will shout out to Zoomers if you want to use a raise hand function. We will call on you. So the floor is open, and Liliana, back to her position with the first question. Sorry, Jerry.
I'm used to it.
So much, Damon. I have two related questions that concern the unique standing of the Eastern State Penitentiary. You have told us the story of the inside and the outside, how articles were written from the outside, and also contexts made. But have their articles been exchanged from other prisons? Has there been a network of journalism, not just of news? So I want to hear a bit more about that. And the second thing is the Eastern Penitentiary is so unique as a building. This is how you started. And so much of a tourist attraction, even early on, I'm thinking about Charles Dickens' American Notes and so on. Has that kind of history and confidence translated into the self-confidence of the prison newspaper? I mean, is there a relationship there?
Great questions. I'll answer your second one first. I think that there is a relationship in the confidence of the way that prison administrators felt about their experiment in the 18th century, in the 19th century, and also how they treated journalism in the 20th century. As you pointed out, in the 1800s, Eastern State was open as a tourist attraction. You could purchase a ticket, walk the cell blocks, and you didn't need to have any relationship to the prison, the people that were in it, or its mission. And I think that that tells us that prison administrators were quite confident in the way that they were running the place. I think it's worth pointing out that that didn't last forever, and eventually tourists stopped coming to Eastern State Penitentiary or were stopped being allowed to. But I love your question about whether or not that confidence also comes through in the journalism of the 20th century. A lot of times when folks talk about the penal press, they note that it was done with the kind of approval of the institution, if the publication was above board. So what I mean by that is that if the publication was clandestine, then the content of it could be very subversive, right? But in the case of the umpire and the Eastern Echo, it wasn't clandestine. It was intended to be consumed by the public. And we should assume that the administration had the final say on what the content of the paper was. We can tell by the ending of the Eastern Echo that the administration did exercise a lot of control. So I think that control and confidence can be used interchangeably here. When the content of the publication was a shining reflection of the institution, I think the administrators were eager to get it out. And perhaps when it reflected challenges or threats to how the administration was running the prison, they may have been more hesitant about who could see it and whether it went out. That's a really good question. Your first question is also brilliant. Were incarcerated people writing to each other through these newspapers? And the answer is yes. I showed a slide earlier that few paragraphs from the first editor about what the Echo is intended to do. Later on in that paragraph, it says, if you don't give us anything that's interesting enough, we'll just use articles from other prison magazines and put it in here. And we see that a lot, but more so what we see is less filler, like I just described, and really more of a dialogue. I won't go too far deep into this, but in the early 19-teens, before Prohibition had become the law of the land, prisoners at Eastern State started and wrote a petition begging the state to stop the sale of alcohol. And they did it for a number of reasons. And that petition made news throughout other prison magazines in the United States. So we see other prisons say, I want to start this petition, urging my state to end the sale of alcohol too, because of what we're seeing at Eastern State. So we do see an exchange of ideas from one prison to the next. And I think to your point, if we do create an exhibit about this, that's something that should be highlighted front and center. Today, for example, is exceedingly difficult for a person in prison to communicate with another person in prison. It's outright policy that they ought not to. So to have these networks of communications is really important. You're bringing up a really amazing point.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I have a couple quick comments and then my questions. One is like on the filler question, but we have to, that's not just filler though. I mean, that is the history of newspapers. Like reprinting stuff from other newspapers is totally still we have AP and all that today. So that is part of the professional job that they're doing, I would say, right?
You're right.
The other point on the baseball, I mean, you mentioned, that the baseball team is integrated 50 years before the prison. It's also 30, 40 years before the official integration of Major League Baseball. So, I just wonder if there was any awareness among Major League Baseball. I mean, you did point out Connie Mack was of what's going on inside of the prison.
They must have known that.
Whether there's any.
Maybe Babe Ruth came to Eastern State in this period as well, so I'm sure that he would have noticed that.
And that would be fascinating to know if anyone said anything at the time. Then my question is, the print shop they're running is like a serious print shop.
Yeah.
The machines are, state-of-the-art machines at that time. So do we know how people learned how to run that print shop? Were any of them formerly working in print shops on the outside? And so I'm curious about that education. And then also whether there's any documents about when people get out, do they continue in that profession?
Great questions. I'll answer your last one first. I personally do not know if people who contributed to the Umpire or the Echo went on to have writing careers afterwards. Eastern State does a great job of talking about what happens to a person when they're incarcerated. We could do a better job of talking about what happened to a person before they got to prison and what happens to them once they left prison. But I don't know the answer as far as who was writing after their incarceration or not. It's a brilliant question. It deserves research. Your question about who was teaching these people, how did they learn how to operate the press? These workshops were staffed by civilians. So not prison workers, but civilian workers who were working in printing were coming in and teaching that trade to a very privileged group of incarcerated people. Again, this was a desirable position. Other jobs like working in food or maintenance would have been on the opposite end of that spectrum. Also with some civilian oversight, but really these specialized careers like print shop had civilian workers coming in and training people how to work those machines and do those tasks while they were incarcerated. I can't speak for printing, but I will say that there are examples of people bringing their skills to their time of incarceration from before. I'm thinking specifically about doctors who would end up practicing medicine during their incarceration and who had been doctors before their imprisonment. But I can't say for sure whether or not somebody was working in printing and then during their incarceration was working in printing as well. These questions are bringing up a really important point, which is that the research that I need to do going forward is really on the individual, seeing what skills they brought with them into the prison and what skills they took with them after they left.
Yeah, because the most famous print shop apprentice is Benjamin Franklin, right? And so one could imagine, okay, civilians might be running it, but it's one thing where this was a serious operation, and prisoners probably got good enough, some of them you would think, to run a lot of it. Do you know that? Do we know that?
If they were running it on their own?
At some point, some of them must have become skilled enough and worked there long enough.
Oh, are you saying work unsupervised in the
Yeah.
prison? I can't say that for sure. I'm hesitant.
Or manage in a way that, you know.
Yeah, there is a theme
some
throughout.
They manage, but not.
Yeah, there is a theme throughout Eastern State's history of varying levels of self-governance and autonomy among the incarcerated people. So I think it's totally safe to assume that at some points, incarcerated people were working without supervision. It probably happened more so than I think. I usually only hear about examples like that when it became a problem, like when somebody would escape because they were being unsupervised or something like that.
Yeah.
But I think it's totally fair to say that people were working with little or no oversight as their skills developed past a certain point.
So Sarah Simons has, sorry.
Yeah, Sarah was.
Simons is raising her hand. One more thing. Maya Moritz says, an idea for turning the prison newspapers into a permanent exhibit. The podcast Criminal recently did an episode on another prison newspaper in North Carolina. I think the best bits are about the people behind the paper who look into daily prison life and how the papers affected prisoners beyond their stay. Those elements would be wonderful to include. And then she gives a link to the podcast.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sarah, do you want to unmute and ask your question? May need to repeat it.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for this. I have two quick questions. I think actually that you've answered one. One is, what is the role of censorship as far as these newspapers are concerned? And the second is, so my uncle was incarcerated in Leavenworth for being a conscientious objector. Were there conscientious objectors in Eastern State given the what the director felt as far as, you know, patriotism and all?
Great question. I do not know of anybody incarcerated for conscientious objection. It's a great question though. And your relatives stay at Leavenworth also reminds me that they had a phenomenal newspaper as well. And there was some interplay between the Eastern Echo and that publication as well. And then your first question was, I'm sorry.
Censorship.
Oh, about censorship. So when John gave the introduction to this talk, he pointed out correctly that so much of what we know about the history of prisons is told to us by administrators. And that's what makes these publications so interesting, is it's one of the very few examples where we get the perspective of somebody who's incarcerated. What I'm getting at is that I don't know a whole lot about censorship, because the only way I would know about it is if the incarcerated person was writing about it. And if they were, it may have been censored. So we know, for example, that about the example of censorship that I gave there at the end, why the Echo went out of publication. I think it's fair to say that there was some editing happening at the administrative level, but I don't have any source material right now to prove that. It's a great point. It's something that should definitely be considered and researched, but I don't know much about censorship beyond that very last issue of the Echo. Great question.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's get Ariel and then Bill, and then we'll go back here.
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering if about that last issue of the Echo, that April issue. Do you have any suggestions of where that, is that like in the archive somewhere or lost forever?
Or did they never issue it?
So
But they were asked to make revisions, so there must be something.
Oh, yeah, that's
Right.
true.
So to my mind, that's actually one of the most interesting parts about this that we draw a lot of people in. So I don't know if it's helpful, but if you could just find it.
Yeah. If only, right? Yeah, if we could find that last issue, if we could find the 2 missing years of the umpire, that would be great. I think the one thing that's in our advantage for the Echo is that there may still be people living that were involved in it, whether they were administrators or they were writing, or even the children and grandchildren of some of those historical figures certainly living, and may know more about that than we do. But as far as I know, the issue is lost or is it's certainly not in Eastern State's collection. I of course wish that it were, and I agree with you. I think that that would really be something that would hook visitors into a more permanent exhibit.
Yeah, Bill.
Thank you so much. One thing you had mentioned was the use of Eastern State as a tourist attraction. And I was thinking, I mean, it's still peppering. It's still a tourist attraction. I've been to the haunted house there a few years back, and I wonder like what you see as the relationship between your mission as the institution's mission as from a historical perspective, and it's quite different, I think. Place as a still as an attraction in that way.
Are you asking how we reconcile those two things?
Yes.
It's a great question. We get it a lot. So the question was, how does Eastern State Penitentiary historic site, as it operates today, work alongside our fall fundraiser, which is now called Halloween Nights? It starts next week. Tickets are available. I think we do it gracefully, and it's taken a lot of time to get to this point. So we are open every day as a museum and historic site. You can come in from 10 to 5, take tours, check out our exhibits, our artist installation. That never changes, even during the fall time. And then during the fall time at night, we do this really incredible flip between like 5 and 6 p.m. and we turn the site into something completely different. In the past, there has not been any educational component to the Halloween fundraiser. During COVID-19, we took 2020 off. And when we came back, the whole fall fundraiser was rebranded. It's now got a different name, Halloween Nights, and it has way more education built into it. So we re-recorded our audio tour, which is narrated by actor and director Steve Buscemi. And Mr. Buscemi was kind enough to tweak part of that specifically for our Halloween listeners, right? And that's just one small example of what we're doing to make it more educational at night. We're also giving small guided tours. Our exhibit on mass incarceration, which is called Prisons Today, Questions in the Age of Mass Incarceration, is now open during that fall fundraiser for the first time ever. And our 16-foot tall infographic, we call it the Big Graph, which shows the US rate of incarceration over time, and it gets really high at the end. We illuminate that, and we have programming surrounding that during our fall fundraiser. So the way that we reconcile those two things today is to bring them together and to inject more educational and museum content into our Halloween fundraiser. But there's only one way to know for sure. You'll just have to come back.
Look at Jerry. Sorry to keep you waiting, Jerry.
I mean, your question is whether this is of interest enough to be an exhibit, and clearly it is. It's hugely interesting. A couple of thoughts, maybe questions. I'm not sure. I think the issue of censorship and self-censorship is incredibly hard to parse and incredibly important. What struck me in the presentation of the umpire in particular is it was remarkably upbeat. I mean, you made it sound like Eastern State Penitentiary would be a fun place to be. Like a camp. And I'm wondering whether that is the overall tone of the umpire, how that is different in the case of the Eastern Echo, which is indeed coming 40 years later, but is coming with a political impulse, right, which is stated up front. I'm wondering if there's any way to glean who is allowed or encouraged to write and who is not, and what the mechanism for that is. Very interesting that the editor of the Eastern Echo writes his letter to the editor and says, "This is the only issue I'm going to be around for." Right. So this is somebody who was at the end of this sentence. We don't know what he was in for, but you know, what can we say about the privilege of the people who write? And then finally, my last ramble is you know, even when you list the teammates on the baseball teams, they're listed not by name but by numbers. Quite extraordinarily, when you show the monument for the prisoners who have been paroled, fought in the war, and died, they're listed not by name but by number, which is just absolutely mind-boggling. And yet, do the articles always have bylines? Or when do bylines appear? So when are writers identified not by number but by name? And to what degree do you find individual personalities and sensibilities emerging in these articles that have names to them and the rest of the
They're all great. And I really like what you said about the tone of the umpire. As somebody who's as familiar with the building as I am, sometimes I lose touch of that like human element that comes through in the writing and the way that y'all kind of understood it as being like a camp or some desirable place to live. It's really interesting for somebody like me to hear, but I take your point, and it definitely is more light than the Echo, for example. What you're saying about who's writing, who has the privilege of writing, I think that that research and those identities would be really telling. I'm willing to bet that at least for the umpire, a lot of the contributors were also members of the Honor and Friendship Club, these kinds of like sanctioned organizations within the penitentiary as well. And your last point about whether or not we're able to decipher personality or if people are ever listed by their name either than their number, they are, especially with the Echo, folks are identified by their name. But a lot of times in the umpire, and Whitney and I have talked about this a little bit, is that folks are listed by a nickname a lot of times. So we kind of like lose track of people, or there might be several people with the same nickname or a slight variation of a nickname. We found that with Jack Blackburn. My colleague had to do a lot of parsing to figure out like Jackie and Blackie and like all of these different names and who it might have been. So your point is taken. And I do think that personalities are reflected in the writing. And I think, and I hope that our museum visitors would be able to pick up on that as well if they took a closer look at the publications.
Is that reflecting any kind of official policy where they're not allowed to use their names in the earlier period and maybe it's looser later? Is that like, our only number X?
Yeah, I don't know if it was an official policy, but the fact that they are listed by number on the plaque is something that we talk about a lot at Eastern State, and why that may have been the case. There are many different theories about this to protect people's anonymity, and maybe they don't want to be stigmatized by the fact that they were formerly incarcerated, or maybe it's that the warden wanted all of the focus to be on him and not really on the people who served in the war. There's a lot of theories about that. But it is interesting that we go from identifying people by their number, their nickname, and then eventually their actual name, and whether or not that was sanctioned. These are all amazing questions to look into if we go something permanent.
You know, there's one thing on tone, Gary, that I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, of course, but chronologically it is. I mean, there's a kind of trench newspaper feel to those. You know, the World War I newspaper printed in trenches with the kind of crazy light tone, even though it's a place that, you know, it's war and oppression. I mean, there's something weirdly reminiscent to me about that. And
there's an article in the Umpire, because I had students tagging me this summer, and there's one in the early Umpires that's reprinted from another prison newspaper, and it says like, don't print things that are serious or bad about prisons, like, because of course you're there, like you're reading it and you are there in the situation, right? Like you want to, if you think about yourself in that situation, are you going to want to read about how horrible the food is, or the beds are? No, either.
Know those things already.
Yeah, that actually really stuck out to me, because I was like, I think it's very difficult for us and I'd be curious how you feel about this, Damon, but like as researchers, to put yourself in that mindset, right? Like to be that author who's using the clear typewriter, or or just the difficulty. I like that you point out the difficulty of just gathering the material to write in that situation. Like all the stuff that we take for granted, like having your pen and your paper and everything, all becomes super fraud in that situation. So.
Which again is striking of this print shop, that said print shop's a very dangerous place. Like, there's a lot of really heavy metal in that print shop, and it's I mean, I'm sure they must have been supervised. Sure. That is dangerous. Right.
A print shop
They're
is
not
also
using
dangerous because of words, right?
Yeah,
But I mean, they don't have double
they
day
don't
on
have
it,
that clear typewriter.
Yeah.
Like they've got
iron bars
metal.
and vocabulary. So let's get Lynn and then Jim.
Thank you. That was wonderful. It got me thinking. I mean, I think it would make a really fascinating exhibit. There's so many components that we've been talking about tonight that could come out of this. I have two quick questions. How soon after they got rid of solitary confinement, they could see this kind of thing coming into the
Immediately.
Okay, the reason I'm asking is because maybe part of the upbeat tone is that the realization that we used to be in solitary confinement and now we can actually do things together. And so we don't necessarily want to say bad things and get ourselves back into solitary confinement. I mean, there could be some relationships there. The other piece is that, and it goes back to something discussed earlier, but I think to the extent that you could do some oral histories around people who were involved at that later period, it could be really interesting, whether it's the people themselves or their families or anything, to try to get now before everybody dies off, to try to get some oral histories. And oral histories are always great when you're doing something like an exhibit and having people there saying something, my father or I was, or, whatever it is, the kinds of things that could be really useful in this exhibit situation.
Well put. I totally agree. And something that I want to say about your first question about how big of a gap is there from the end of solitary confinement to baseball and the press. Yeah. We see hints of this in early issues of The Umpire, where they talk about in 1913 last season's play. The last season we were supposed to be living in isolation. So The Umpire tells us a little bit about how that transition took place. And how clunky it probably was, and the fact that solitary confinement almost certainly did not end in 1913. It probably never even existed in the way that the administrators imagined it. The Umpire gives us little glimpses.
So this is where your reams of official documents are actually totally feeble, because they're not even telling you one of the most obvious things about the most famous prison and whatever. Yeah, amazing. Jim.
Yeah, because I'm wondering whether that also, the definition of solitary confinement changes over time. So it's going on. They considered solitary confinement kind of like what we do now, but not what they did at the beginning. The question I had was more about the print shop operation. As Zach pointed out, it's a lot of equipment, but not only is it a lot of equipment, it's a lot of very expensive equipment. So for the state that invests that kind of money in the prison, it had to be getting a real return on that, because back in those days, they wouldn't just throw this money away just, to keep prisoners occupied. They did it because they were going to get a return. So I'm curious about, did any of these did they produce anything for outside the prison system? And then if they did, in terms of all the different industries or activities, revenue generating activities of the prison at that time, was the printing operation one of the leading ones? Where did it rank within that category? And then ultimately, kind of related to that, is how much printing did it do for the Bureau of Prisons for the state? Was another big prison press in another state penitentiary in Pennsylvania? I don't know how many of them were at the time, but was that the main one? And were they actually technically saving the state a lot of money by doing all this work in-house? I know, like here at Penn, we had our own printing operation from around the 19-teens to the 1950s, where we actually physically printed our catalogs here and a lot of university publications rather than sending things out.
Historically, at Eastern State, the print shop cranked out all sorts of materials for all sorts of government agencies, schools, hospitals, other departments, or other prisons within the Department of Corrections. So you're absolutely right, and private jobs. Those are just state agencies that they were doing. But they did all sorts of jobs, public and private. The print shop, to my understanding, was one of, if not the most lucrative prison industry at Eastern State in the mid-20th century. There were others. There was a dental lab where like dentures and things were made, mostly for people that were incarcerated, the same way that prison industries operate today. So in Pennsylvania today, there's a prison that makes shoes. There's a prison that makes dentures. There's a prison that makes eyewear, right? And it's all
Specialized economies of different.
my understanding is that Eastern State was, the print shop at Eastern State was making the printed materials for the entire Department of Corrections, other state agencies, and even private jobs as well. And you're right, it had to be lucrative enough to put all this expensive equipment, to train people, to bring in civilian workers, etc. My understanding is that it was. Prison labor continues to be very lucrative for people that control it.
Which is a good thing that you can use to talk about the, use and exploitation of labor as a larger topic. You're going to use it like this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay. Yeah.
sure.
Okay, Grace first.
In terms of the use of the print shop in all of these different contexts, I was thinking as well, at what point did actual prisoners' records start to be in any way like digitized or technology, rather than just being handled people were incarcerated, people were convicted, or different indigent records. Was there any interaction there between printing, printing the newspapers and printing the people making the research? You know what I mean? I feel like that would be an interesting overlap if they were both.
Are you asking if the print shop was also doing other printing work, like for the administration, like if somebody was being punished? Or...
Yeah.
It's a good
Were
question.
they printing, one easy way to say, were they printing the intake forms?
Yeah, but they printing the records.
Makes sense. It would be. That's a great circular.
It would make sense. I haven't seen a source that says specifically like we print all these intake cards in the print shop, but why wouldn't they? I think that they do. But you raise an interesting question. If I'm understanding it correctly, which would be how close is a prisoner to their own record?
Yeah, that is kind of what I was going to say. I thought, that is the print shop record. That's kind of overlap.
Right.
It kind of breaks down quite a lot.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's important. You're bringing up a really interesting point, and it highlights another area of life in prison, which is that some incarcerated people are treated differently by the administration than others, and enjoy some privilege that other prisoners might not enjoy. Certainly, the print shop was a coveted place to work, and so we can make some assumptions about the status of people within the, political economy of the prison. That people working in the print shop had unique access.
Please, sorry, remind me your name. Max. Yeah. So thank you for talking again, and the material, it was quite interesting to watch it find writing robots, quite modern one. So my question is, I studied the archive and read about the other side, and it was a sort of refinement camp, right, containment camp for the immigrants.
Yeah.
And they were very specific about their ethnic background and so on and so forth. And some of these people, most of them stayed in the East Coast, New Jersey and New York, and probably came down to Philadelphia. If they were in prison, did they keep the records of their ethnic backgrounds? And my related question is also the second. Did it reflect on their publications? Like when they wrote, they were concerned about outside children or what was going on, but were they, they were also concerned about world affairs when it was a world war, it began that. But were they concerned about any other subjects? Because you studied it, right? The digitized version has subjects and you categorize them by subjects. Are they concerned about the world outside the United States and they have specific anything for drawing?
Yeah, great question. I'll answer your second one first. They were concerned with what was happening in the world, especially when there was a world war happening. That's a big part of the umpire, for example. But yeah, they're concerned with regional news, with international news, with all sorts of things, with correctional and prison policies internationally as well, looking at an international prison perspective, which is really meta. So for sure, they were interested in other issues. Your question about race is amazing, and ethnicity, and should be a part of any prison museum's programming. Yes, prison administrators documented where somebody was from, whether it was Philadelphia or Italy or anywhere in between. They were always nation of origin was important. But when we start to talk about race, it gets really strange because prison administrators, first of all, are assigning race to people. They're not asking somebody, how do you identify?
Yeah.
They're just writing down how they view that person's race. And the way that administrators documented race sometimes changes even for the same person. So somebody could come into the prison in 1910, be classified as white, come back 5 years later and be classified as black, right? And that's totally up to the administrator who's taking that record at the time. All records of prison race historically are problematic for this reason, right? First of all, we can have a spirited debate about race in general, but prison administrators were taking a lot of liberties when they were assigning race to people, which had profound impacts on the individual. Like I said, the prison was segregated by race. So how the person was identified by a strange administrator determined the conditions of their entire incarceration, where they lived, how they worked, all sorts of stuff like that. Maybe even the treatment that they received. Great question.
There's some other implications like Pennsylvanians of German descent during the First World War, for example.
Sure.
You know, where you have some evidence in the newspaper, what's going on there, a lot of problems. Lila.
Sarah Watson has a question.
Sarah, please go ahead. And Harry, you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, then Harry.
Hi. Damon, thank you so much for this talk. I really enjoyed it. And I'm sad I'm not there to see the clear typewriter, which relates to my question, which is a question about your question. I don't know that we've answered many of your questions about drawing visitors, except to say that, yes, this material is also amazing and people would be interested. But I'm curious about your thoughts. I feel like it's a truism in the museum world that exhibitions have to be interactive to really hook people because no one just wants to look at things anymore, right? And I feel like Eastern State Penitentiary, to my mind, does a really good job of doing this pretty sensitively because obviously the idea of like now you will interact with the experience of incarceration raises all kinds of problematic possibilities. And I think there's a sort of interesting range of media and even like the big graph and the way that you use the space and the audio tour. But I'm really just interested, it's a way of asking your question back to you and thinking about particularly the printing press and the printed materials, if interactivity or whatever we want to call that, participation is something that you've been contemplating as an aspect of what an exhibition like this could look like.
Absolutely. Thank you for your kind words. And that is definitely something that we consider as museum workers is how we can be more hands-on. I think it's why we bought this typewriter, is so that we weren't just showing our visitors, a printout of the Echo or the Umpire. We actually wanted folks to type on a typewriter. And one of the, yeah, we're going to show you. Get a look at it. Can you go down a little bit?
Down.
Tilted.
Second left.
Yeah, so that's a Swin Tech.
Down.
That's the company that makes that typewriter. And we absolutely want our visitors to be hands-on. We want to, show, not tell, as they say. That's really important. I wonder if also we could get our hands on some of that big machinery we've been talking about as well. I'm thinking about like the Ben Franklin Museum. It's got the whole like print thing there. And if we could do something like that at Eastern State as well. But yes, the physicality of the artifact is really important. Also because so many people who are coming to Eastern State now may have never used a typewriter before. It might not have been a part of
already an antique.
Yeah, it might not have been a part of their home or their educational experience. I was asked at a conference recently if that's a barrier to getting young people engaged in prison journalism as an exhibit. My experience is the opposite. People who grew up without a typewriter gravitate towards it more quickly than people who grew up with one. So to answer your question, yeah, more physical artifacts, more hands-on, which is tricky in a nearly 200-year-old building that's a stabilized ruin. We normally ask visitors not to touch things. So giving them a pathway to be hands-on in an exhibit like this is going to be interesting and challenging, but I think it's the only way to do it.
And it might offer, I don't know if you agree, Sarah, a way of displaying prisoner agency that feels a little less problematic in the way you're suggesting, rather than the, let's just say, not so great, go stand in a cell and feel like what it, that version of the Eastern State experience.
Exactly. We want a visitor to feel like a journalist and then consider what it would have been like to be a journalist in prison, or a baseball player, and then consider what would it be like to play baseball in a place like this. Great questions. Thank you so much for your comment.
Let's take last question from Eric.
Yeah. So I thought this was very engaging. I'm really happy that I got to hear this tonight. So I have two questions. The first one is about bringing people in, and then more of a historian's question. The first question is, can you develop a biographical dimension to the story? Can you intensively research certain individuals so that you would have, let's say, a case with the stories of different individuals? Maybe the sources aren't there, but if they are, biography is certainly engaging for audiences. Second question has to do with literacy. I'm quite impressed by the high level of literacy that's on display in everything that you've shown us. Do you have any comments about that, about how exceptional this was, whether these are people who were white collar, convicted of white collar crimes, who had ended up there and could manage this kind of work? That's a really very important dimension.
Absolutely. I'll answer your first question first, which was about a biographical component to some of the people who are contributing or talked about in these newspapers. Absolutely, it's totally necessary. Some challenges that we're going to have is that we know so much about the worst thing that these people did.
Yes.
Right, but we don't really know a lot about all the great things that they did.
Yes.
So when we assign a biography to someone in prison or a historical figure like this, I at least try to be careful to give the most complete picture of the individual and de-emphasize the crime that got them to Eastern State. I know that I wouldn't want to be featured based on the worst mistake that I ever made. And that can be difficult because the records aren't always consistent. And we just know so much more about the bad thing than the great thing. But as I think I've shown, the great research can yield impressive results here, like the story of Jack Blackburn, right? We didn't even talk about why he was in prison, and I don't think we need to, because that's not really the most important story there. It gets a little trickier when we talk about later publications like the Echo. Paradoxically, at Eastern State, we know a whole lot more about people who lived at Eastern State in the 1800s than we do about people in the 1900s. Wow. There's a number of reasons for that, but by the time we get to the 50s and 60s, we know almost nothing about people who lived at Eastern State. We can pull out some things, like I was able to build that profile with Selby and Chandler, the veteran, based on his military records, things that his family had sent us, stuff I might not have had access to within our own archives. But your point about biography is well taken, and I think that that's how we should approach things. Your question about literacy, I don't know if I have all of the answers, but I think about literacy among Eastern State prisoners somewhat. I think by the middle of the 20th century, most people at Eastern State could read and write. In the latter part of, certainly when Eastern State opened and up until the 1870s, literacy is less common among the incarcerated population. Mail policies at Eastern State shift over time based on prisoner literacy, which is interesting. And I don't know how literate the prison population was in 1950. I know more about that in the 19th century, but I haven't really considered literacy when I think about the Eastern Echo, but maybe I should. It sounds like it's something that we ought to know. I'm also thinking about articles that are written in languages other than English to try and connect with people no matter where they are on that scale? It's a great question.
Well, there's so much. We feel like we just started, which is the sign of a fantastic talk. So thank you.